It was supposed to be a night of honor, a night for heroes. Outside the grand arched entrance of the Montclair Hotel, an Art Deco fortress of light and crystal, an old man stood, shoulders squared against the chill in the evening air. Frank Doyle, 75 years old but carrying his years with a soldier's stubborn dignity, held a single folded invitation in his weathered hands. The words, "Charity Gala, honoring our forgotten veterans," were inked in sweeping gold script, now flecked with the beginnings of a drizzle. He wore his best jacket, pressed but well worn, a relic from another time. His gray hair was combed back with a soldier's care, and his eyes, sharp beneath the brim of a battered cap, scanned the doorman and the cluster of guests just inside the velvet rope. A black SUV purred at the curb, dropping off a couple in gleaming evening attire. Laughter and the faint strains of a jazz quartet drifted through the doors, warm and inviting. Frank stepped forward, clutching the invitation like a lifeline. The security guard, a young man with a haircut sharp as glass and a name tag reading Tyson, looked him over and cocked a brow, eyes drifting from Frank's faded shoes to his old army pin. He forced a polite smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Evening, sir. This entrance is for gala guests only," he said, glancing back to his partner as if asking, "Can you believe this guy?" Frank held out the invitation. "I'm a guest. My daughter, Claire Doyle, she's speaking tonight." Tyson took the card with the barest touch, squinting at the name. His partner, a heavier-set man with arms crossed, stifled a smirk. They looked down at a clipboard, flipping pages. The older man's presence, his stillness, his self-containment, seemed to unsettle them. "We'll need to confirm," Tyson said. "Please step aside for a minute." Frank nodded. "Sure, take your time." Behind him, another couple drifted closer, curious. The woman leaned into her date and whispered, "Did he just walk off the street?" Her voice carried, just enough to sting. Frank didn't flinch, but he caught the way their eyes slid over him, evaluating, dismissing. He stood a little taller, chin up, jaw set. "You've stood your ground before, old man. Don't break now." Inside the entryway, a photographer circled, camera at the ready, eager for anything that might liven up the endless stream of polite smiles and champagne flutes. His lens found Frank, paused, and clicked, a snapshot of an old man standing in the rain, just outside the world he once defended. As Tyson radioed someone at the front desk, the drizzle thickened, dampening Frank's collar and raising a fresh chill that seeped through his bones. Still, he waited, unmoving, gaze steady on the ballroom doors. Every few seconds, guests would drift past, each glance a little colder, a little more suspicious. A valet, barely 20, acne bright against pale skin, sidled by with a stack of keys, glanced at Frank, then muttered just loud enough for the guards to hear, "Why do these guys always show up expecting a handout?" Tyson grunted in amusement. Frank let the comment pass. He'd learned long ago which battles were worth fighting. Inside, through the crack of the door, he could see the beginnings of the program. The MC's voice, all velvet and polish, introduced the night's keynote. And now a woman who has dedicated her life to the cause, Claire Doyle. Frank smiled quietly to himself, pride softening his features for a split second. "That's my girl." He craned his neck, listening for her voice, catching only the faintest echoes, but Tyson stepped back between him and the entrance. "Sorry, sir. You're not on our immediate list. We're waiting on confirmation. You'll need to wait over there, please." He gestured toward a shadowy corner by the big marble planter, out of sight from the main entrance. Frank's grip on the invitation tightened. He glanced around. Guests in designer gowns and tuxedos swept by, not meeting his eyes. One woman stepped wide, her lips pinched. An older man muttered, "Somebody should call the police." The city, in its finest, was out in force, and yet not a soul seemed to recognize him. He stepped to the planter, heart heavy but back straight, resting one hand on the cold stone. "You've waited in worse places," he reminded himself. The night air bit at his cheeks. Behind him, the hotel's revolving door spun again and again, a blur of privilege and purpose. Someone bumped into his shoulder, barely muttering an apology. Another flash, another photo, caught his profile, caught the faded ribbon on his lapel. The photographer jotted a note. "Suspicious man loiters outside charity gala." Frank closed his eyes for a second, just listening. From inside, applause thundered. A speech in full swing, laughter, clinking glasses, music rising. He could almost hear Claire's words, though the specifics escaped him. Only the tone carried pride, conviction, hope. He looked at the invitation once more, ran a thumb over his daughter's name, and felt the familiar ache in his chest. He'd served his country, raised his daughter alone after her mother passed, worked any job he could find, made every rent check, fixed every flat tire, stitched every wound, weathered every storm. Now, standing in the rain, he wondered when exactly the world had stopped seeing him. When did he become invisible? Inside, Claire spoke of honoring the forgotten veterans, those who gave everything and asked for nothing. She had no idea her own father was standing in the cold, her words bouncing off marble and glass, unheard by the one man who needed them most. Frank tucked the invitation into his coat pocket, let out a slow breath, and waited. No complaints, no drama, just patience. A hotel staffer passed by, pausing at the sight of him, a small act of kindness in his eyes. "You doing okay, sir?" the staffer asked, offering a bottled water, sincere. Frank accepted it, managed a thin smile. "You're the first one to look me in the eye today." The staffer blinked, caught off guard, then nodded and slipped back inside. Above the entrance, the hotel's glowing sign reflected in the puddles at Frank's feet, shimmering like a memory just out of reach. Behind the glass, a world moved on, warm, bright, full of promises. Outside, Frank stood alone, a hero left in the cold. But this night was only beginning. Frank shifted his weight on the cold stone planter, feeling the ache in his knees and lower back. The drizzle had become a steady rain now, streaking the gold-lettered invitation peeking from his jacket pocket. Cars rolled up to the curb in a steady stream, headlights glancing off wet pavement. Drivers in pressed uniforms opened doors for men and women in evening finery, emerald gowns, navy suits, stoles of fox fur, dripping jewelry. For a moment, the scene felt like another world, one that Frank only remembered from black and white movies, never from his own life. Inside, the gala was coming to life. Warmth and light glowed through the tall glass windows, and Frank could see silhouettes drifting between tables. Crystal chandeliers reflected in the mirrored walls, making the space inside seem impossibly vast and bright. Frank watched, hands stuffed in his pockets, as a limousine stopped, letting out a trio of donors he'd seen on TV before. They didn't see him. The security guard, Tyson, and his partner hovered by the entrance, casting quick glances at Frank every few minutes. Their radio chirped, and Tyson pressed the earpiece closer. "Any word on the old guy?" he asked quietly. "Still checking with the list. Name's not popping up. You want me to have him move on?" came the static reply. Tyson hesitated, looking at Frank's stoic posture, then shrugged. "He's not causing trouble. Let him stand there." A valet ran past, slipping on the wet concrete, nearly colliding with Frank. The kid, skinny and red-faced, shot him a look, muttered, Why do these guys always show up expecting a handout? Then ducked his head and hurried off with a set of car keys. Frank heard every word. He looked down at his hands. They were large and square, the knuckles swollen with age and old fractures, fingers rough with calluses. There was a time when these hands had stopped bleeding, saved lives. Now, they just trembled with the cold. He was used to being overlooked, mistaken for someone looking for charity or just lost. But tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight, he was invited. Tonight, his daughter would speak about veterans like him. If only he could get inside. Frank's gaze drifted to the entrance, where the doormen smiled warmly at each new arrival, their hands extending with practiced grace. There was a certain choreography to these galas. Coats whisked away, greetings exchanged, laughter that sounded rehearsed. None of them saw him, not really. From inside, Claire's voice suddenly rose above the music, piped through hidden speakers and out to the street. Frank recognized the cadence, the steel in her tone. She'd always been a fighter, that girl. He remembered the way she'd learned to ride a bike, her scraped knees and fierce glare when he suggested a break. She hadn't wanted help then either. Tonight, Claire was saying, we honor the men and women who sacrificed everything for a nation that too often forgets its own promises. My father taught me what service meant, not through medals or stories, but through action, humility, and kindness. We are here to remember not just the names on plaques, but the people behind them. Frank's chest swelled with pride, but it was mixed with a sharp sadness. He longed to see her, to be part of the moment she'd worked so hard for. But instead, he stood shivering, listening from the shadows. The mayor, tall and impeccably dressed, rose to speak after Claire. He gestured grandly to a huge screen behind the podium. Let us remember their faces, their courage, he said, as a slideshow began. Photographs flickered by. Young soldiers in muddy uniforms, grainy black and whites from distant wars, the American flag waving above sandbagged trenches. One image, almost lost among the others, showed a blurry figure pulling a wounded man to safety under a barrage of smoke and bullets. Frank recognized it instantly. Cambodia, 1969. He'd never told anyone about that night, not even Claire. To see it now, projected for hundreds of strangers, made his hands tremble. The audience inside the ballroom applauded. Outside, Frank stood alone, the cold seeping into his bones. The contrast was sharp and painful. Inside, honor speeches. Outside, humiliation. He wasn't even considered part of the crowd they claimed to celebrate. It was as if the glass between him and the ballroom was thicker than steel. Another guest, a wealthy woman in pearls, stepped out to take a call. She glanced at Frank with open suspicion, clutching her purse tighter. Frank stepped back, giving her space. He'd learned to make himself small, to avoid being noticed, but tonight it felt like an accusation. He tried again, quietly approaching Tyson. Any news? He asked. Tyson, half apologetic, shook his head. Still waiting on confirmation, sir. Sorry about the delay. Frank nodded, the words catching in his throat. He forced a smile. No problem, son. I've waited longer for less. The rain picked up, streaming off the awning and noisy sheets. Frank watched a mother shepherd her son through the doors, the boy turning to stare at him with curiosity. For a moment, their eyes met, and Frank smiled. The boy smiled back before his mother hustled him inside. Frank sat down on the planter's edge, letting his gaze wander across the wet city street. The noise and light of the gala felt a world away. He could almost hear echoes from his past. A helicopter's rotors thumping overhead, the desperate shouts of medics, the rattle of gunfire. the low groan of wounded men calling for help. Those nights had been colder, lonelier, but he'd never felt invisible then. A hotel staffer, mid-20s, hair slicked back, suit slightly too big, walked by and paused. He glanced at Frank, then at the guards, uncertain. "Can I get you anything, sir? Something warm?" Frank shook his head. "I'm fine, just waiting for someone." The staffer nodded, handed him a bottle of water anyway. "You're the first one to look me in the eye today," Frank said softly. The young man hesitated, then offered a real smile. "It's a good night for people to see each other, don't you think?" Frank nodded, touched more than he expected. Inside, the music swelled, laughter rising with it. The speeches rolled on, the audience clapping at all the right moments. Frank's heart ached with every cheer, every toast to men and women like him. Like he was a ghost, honored but not welcomed. He looked up at the storm clouds rolling over the city, at the golden light pouring from the ballroom, and wondered how many other veterans sat outside places like this, uninvited to their own tributes. He pressed the invitation flat on his lap, reading Claire's name one more time. For a brief, fragile moment, he closed his eyes and let the warmth of pride push back the cold. He had been left outside, left in the cold, but in his daughter's words, he heard hope. Even if no one else saw him, she still remembered. And somewhere deep inside, Frank decided he wouldn't leave, not yet. Not until he saw Claire. Not until she knew he'd come. The night was far from over, and sometimes the hardest battles were the ones fought in silence, waiting for the world to finally see you. The rain eased up, leaving the street shimmering under the city's amber lights. Frank remained perched on the planter outside the Montclair Hotel, shoulders hunched against the cold, but his mind wandered far from this wet, indifferent curb. For a long moment, he stared through the golden glow of the entrance, watching silhouettes flicker by, waiters with silver trays, guests swirling in laughter, the world spinning forward without him. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the invitation again. The paper was damp and wrinkled now, the gold script dulled by water, but Claire's name was still clear. He ran a thumb along the letters, as if tracing a memory that might fade if he let go for even a second. He looked up at the city lights, then folded the card gently, tucking it into his inside pocket, close to his chest. A wave of fatigue swept through him, heavier than the rain, heavier than the stares from strangers. He sat, resting his palms on his knees, in the hush between cars and the muted clatter of celebration inside. Frank let his mind slip back through time, years vanishing in a heartbeat, as the sound of distant thunder became the drum of helicopter blades, and the cold stone beneath him melted into the mud of another world. He could still smell it. Cambodia, 1969, a stench of sweat, gun oil, blood, and red earth after the monsoon. He saw himself, young and lean and desperate, crawling through a field of elephant grass as tracers ripped the night sky. The world pulsed with the thud of artillery. Next to him, his friend Manny clutched a bleeding leg, eyes wide with terror. "Frank, I don't want to die here." Frank, his heart pounding, checked Manny's wound and tore off his own shirt to make a bandage. "You're not dying today. You hear me?" He remembered dragging Manny through the mud, bullets snapping overhead, his arms burning with exhaustion. Somewhere in the chaos, someone shouted for help. Frank answered, because that's what you did. He'd never thought of himself as a hero, just a medic doing what he could, one step at a time. There was no glory, only survival. A round struck the ground nearby, splattering his face with wet earth. Frank never stopped. He didn't have the luxury of fear. He could still feel the weight of Manny's body slumped across his shoulders, hear the whir of the medevac chopper slicing through the smoke as they stumbled toward the landing zone. The whole world had narrowed to a single thought. Get him home. Get him home. Frank blinked, coming back to the present as a passing siren wailed in the distance. His hands, resting on his knees, flexed unconsciously, as if bracing to lift a fallen comrade again. He exhaled, slow and shaky. These days, nobody asked about the war, not really. People liked parades and speeches, but not the messy details. Frank didn't blame them. He never talked about the nightmares, the wounds that never healed, or the friends who never made it back. Sometimes he thought the world would rather forget what he'd seen, what he'd done to survive. Now he lived alone in a small walk-up, neat but spare. The radio was his company most nights, and his only outing each year was this gala. He saved for it, marked it on his calendar, counted the days. Not for the recognition or the fancy food, but because Claire would be there, standing up for people like him, giving a voice to the stories no one else wanted to tell. Frank smiled at the thought of her. Claire had always been different, fiercely smart, impossibly stubborn. She had inherited his grit, but not his silence. She demanded answers, never looked away from the truth, even when it hurt. When she was 12, she marched into the school principal's office to defend a friend who was being bullied. When she was 16, she spent her weekends volunteering at the VA hospital, listening to old men tell stories no one else remembered. Now she stood on stages and talked about dignity and sacrifice, about what the country owed its veterans. He wished he could tell her how proud he was, how she'd become everything her mother dreamed for her. But words were hard. He'd grown up in an era where men held their feelings close, showed love through quiet actions, a hand on the shoulder, a repaired door, a meal on the table. The drizzle started again, softly at first. Frank fished a faded handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his face. A young hotel worker appeared at the side entrance. He was the same staffer who had offered the water earlier. The kid hesitated, glanced back at the guards, then approached with a gentle, uncertain smile. "Sir, are you sure you don't want to wait inside the lobby? I could ask my manager." Frank shook his head, grateful but stubborn. "Thank you, I'm okay out here. Don't want to cause any trouble." The staffer hesitated. "It's no trouble. It's just, I saw your name on the program. You're Claire Doyle's father, right?" Frank's surprise flashed across his face. "You know my daughter?" "She's famous around here," the kid said with a smile. "Talks about you a lot." Frank chuckled, the sound gruff but warm. "She always did have a big mouth." The staffer laughed, and for a moment, the distance between the old veteran and the world seemed smaller. Then voices called from inside, and the staffer offered one last smile before hurrying back. Frank's smile faded as the door closed. He was proud of Claire, but part of him worried too. It was easier to be proud than to be seen. He wondered if she really understood what it felt like to be forgotten, to become invisible in a crowd. He turned, watching a pair of well-dressed men step out for a smoke, their conversation loud and careless. "You see the lineup tonight?" one said. "Supposedly a real hero's daughter is giving the speech. Maybe she'll cry for the cameras." They didn't see Frank, didn't recognize him. He stood up, stretching aching joints, and wandered a few paces along the sidewalk. In the puddles, the neon sign of the hotel glowed, fractured and shifting, a memory he couldn't quite hold on to. He glanced at his phone. Still no calls, no messages from Claire. He considered leaving, just melting into the night, but the thought of disappointing his daughter was heavier than any humiliation. Inside, he could hear the music start again, the sound muffled but insistent. He imagined the crowd standing for Claire's speech, the applause echoing against crystal and marble. He imagined her looking out at the audience, searching for his face, not knowing he was just beyond the glass. Frank took a breath. Let it out slow. He would stay. That's what a soldier did. That's what a father did. Sometimes, the only way to be seen was to keep showing up, no matter how many doors stayed closed. He sat back down on the planter, shoulders hunched, heart stubborn. In the darkness, the memory of a younger man, muddy, exhausted, carrying a friend to safety, lingered beside him, an old ghost who would not be turned away. Tonight, Frank Doyle would wait. He would wait as long as it took. Back inside the glittering ballroom, Claire Doyle stood at the edge of the stage, trying to steady her breath. The applause from her speech was still echoing, mixing with the clatter of silverware and the low hum of donors congratulating each other on their generosity. She should have felt proud. The mayor had shaken her hand. Old classmates had sent encouraging texts, and the entire night was a testament to her tireless work. But as she stepped behind the curtain, her nerves refused to settle. She pulled out her phone, the screen lighting up with a rush of notifications. A text from hotel security caught her eye. "We had a minor issue with an older man claiming to know you. Think he left." Claire's brow furrowed. For a split second, she didn't think much of it. Gala nights always brought out a handful of gatecrashers and overzealous fans. But something about the wording gnawed at her. She quickly scrolled up, searching for anything she might have missed. The next notification was an alert from a local news account, her name tagged in a post. She clicked on it. A photograph filled her screen. An old man, soaked by rain, standing by the marble planter outside the Montclair Hotel. His expression was patient, dignified, but the camera angle made him look lost, even suspicious. The caption read, "Suspicious man loiters outside charity gala." Claire's heart stuttered in her chest. Even with his face half turned away, she recognized the shape of his shoulders, the set of his jaw, the stubborn tilt of his cap. Her hands started to shake. "Dad, what are you doing out there?" Her mind raced. She had sent the invitation herself, had spoken to the hotel weeks ago, made sure his name was on the list. How could this have happened? She felt a flush of anger, then shame. She'd spent all night telling strangers to honor the forgotten, and here was her own father, left in the rain, mistaken for a beggar or worse. Outside, the party raged on, oblivious to her distress. The mayor was posing for photographs with donors, the jazz band launching into a lively swing. Claire pressed her palm to her mouth, fighting the urge to cry. No, not here, not now. She shot off a text to security. "Where is the man in that photo now? That's my father. Do not let him leave." No response. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she swiped to social media, hoping for any update. Her father's image was already spreading. Retweets, comments, jokes. Only in this city could you get thrown out for looking like a real hero. Someone else posted, "Guess you can't buy a ticket to respect." The sense of injustice burned through her, sharper than the embarrassment. He's not a security risk. He's the reason I'm here at all. Her mind spun through 1,000 memories at once. Her father holding her steady as she learned to swim, bandaging her skinned knees, standing at every graduation, quiet in his pride but fierce in his love. She remembered his stories, not the war stories, those were rare, but the ones about decency, about treating everyone with dignity. Always look a man in the eye, Claire. That's how you let him know he matters. She remembered his rough hands on her shoulder, his steady voice when she was scared. "You're braver than you think, kiddo." The idea that anyone could look at him and see a problem instead of a person made her blood boil. Suddenly, the fancy speeches, the applause, the certificates, they all felt hollow, empty. If her own father couldn't cross the threshold of a party supposedly in his honor, what was the point? Claire pushed through the crowd, barely noticing the guests who called her name or tried to stop her for a selfie. She ducked past the dessert table, out a side door into a service hallway. Her heels clicked furiously on the tile, echoing off the walls. She caught up to a young staffer, the same one who'd offered Frank a water bottle earlier, and grabbed his arm. "Excuse me, did you see an older man outside? About 75, army pin, gray jacket?" The kid nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I offered him some water. He's still out by the front. I think security was supposed to let him in, but..." He trailed off, eyes full of guilt. Claire didn't wait for the rest. She tore down the hallway, out through a side entrance into the wet night air. Her breath puffed in front of her, heart pounding as she rounded the corner. And there he was, her father, sitting quietly on the edge of the planter, rain beating on his shoulders, a half-empty water bottle in his hand. For a moment, she just watched him, her heart breaking at the sight. He looked tired, but not defeated. His posture, even at rest, was proud. She hurried toward him, her voice choked. "Dad!" Frank looked up, surprise flickering across his face. He smiled, slow and warm, as if nothing was wrong in the world. "Hey, Claire Bear," he said, using her childhood nickname. "Didn't expect you to leave your own party." Claire knelt down beside him, taking his hand in both of hers. Up close, she could see the lines on his face, the stubborn strength in his eyes. "What happened?" "I sent your name to everyone. I checked twice." Frank shrugged. "Guess I didn't look the part. They wanted confirmation. Figured I'd wait." His voice was gentle, with a trace of humor, as if to comfort her. Claire's eyes brimmed with tears, anger and love warring inside her. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I should have..." He squeezed her hand, cutting her off. "Don't you apologize. I'm fine. Just another story for the books, huh?" But Claire shook her head, refusing to let him diminish the moment. "No, this isn't right. Not tonight. Not ever." Behind them, the hotel lights glimmered. Inside, the world celebrated itself. Out here in the rain, a daughter remembered what honor really looked like. Not in medals or speeches, but in the quiet strength of a man who waited, who endured, who never made a fuss even when the world forgot him. For the first time all night, Claire didn't care about donors or politicians or cameras. She cared only about making this right for her father, for every father, every mother, every veteran who'd ever been left outside their own story. She stood, determination setting her jaw. "Come with me, Dad. We're going inside. I don't care who tries to stop us." Frank rose, steadying himself. "Lead the way, kiddo." Together they started toward the entrance, hand in hand, united in pride and purpose, ready to face whatever came next. Claire's heart ached, but she was no longer ashamed. Tonight, she would fight for her father the way he'd always fought for her. And inside those shining doors, everything was about to change. The rain had slowed to a whisper as Frank and Claire walked side by side toward the entrance, their steps steady despite the uncertainty ahead. Claire's grip on her father's hand was tight, almost fierce, as if she could anchor him to her side through sheer willpower. Frank's back was straight, chin up. He moved not like a man denied entry, but a man returning to the field after a long absence. Just as they reached the velvet rope, A sleek black sedan rolled to a stop in the hotel's semicircular driveway. Heads turned. The doorman straightened as a chauffeur hurried to open the rear door. Out came General Warren Lewis, a legend to anyone who'd ever worn a uniform, his reputation larger than life even at 90 years old. His white hair was perfectly groomed, his eyes sharp beneath silver brows, his frame lean beneath the ribbons and medals on his suit jacket. He moved not on his own legs, but in a high-backed wheelchair, yet every movement carried authority. The crowd seemed to pause, as if the air itself recognized him. Hotel staff whispered, guests pointed and snapped photos, and the mayor himself broke away from a cluster of donors to offer a handshake. But General Lewis's attention was elsewhere. He scanned the entryway, ignoring the pageantry, his gaze locking on Frank and Claire. For a second, time froze. General Lewis's face changed, a jolt of recognition, then disbelief, then a growing fury. He wheeled himself past the gawking onlookers, straight toward Frank. "Frank Doyle!" His voice cut through the night, rough but unmistakably strong. Frank's eyes widened. He managed a smile, shy and genuine, a look he reserved for the few men on earth he called brother. "Evening, General." General Lewis didn't hesitate. He rolled to the velvet rope and barked at the guards. "Let him through, now!" The guards, caught between confusion and fear, looked at each other, unsure. General Lewis's voice rose, thunderous. "What in God's name is Frank Doyle doing out here, while the rest of you sip cocktails in his honor?" A ripple moved through the crowd. Claire, still gripping her father's hand, stared at the general, awed. She'd seen his name on the invitation, but never expected him to show, let alone intervene. The general turned to the security manager, who had rushed over with apologies spilling from his lips. "Sir, I'm so sorry. There's been a mistake. We're just—" General Lewis cut him off with a sharp wave. "There's only one mistake here, son. You see this man?" He jabbed a finger toward Frank. "He's the reason I'm here. The reason half the men in my company are still alive. If he's not in that ballroom, you can cancel your damn gala." A hush fell over the entrance. Some guests stepped back, embarrassed. Others watched, intrigued by the unfolding drama. The mayor, red-faced and suddenly uncertain, stammered, "General Lewis, Of course, sir. Mr. Doyle is welcome. General Lewis fixed him with a steely stare. "You honor the wrong people tonight, if he's not at the center of your celebration." Frank stood quiet, caught between humility and embarrassment. He never liked a scene, never wanted his name shouted in a crowd. But this was different. The old code, the bond of soldiers, spoke louder than any medal or speech. Claire felt a surge of pride so intense it almost knocked her breath away. For a moment, she saw her father as the world should see him, not as a tired old man in a rain-soaked jacket, but as the hero who had shaped her life, and so many others. Tyson, the security guard, looked like he wished he could disappear. He mumbled, "Sir, you're free to go inside. I apologize for the confusion." Frank nodded, giving the young man a gentle look. "You were doing your job, son. It's all right." General Lewis grinned. Same old Frank, always calm under fire. Without another word, the general motioned for Claire and Frank to follow. He wheeled himself through the doors, scattering waiters and guests, making a path straight for the heart of the gala. Inside, the shift was immediate. The ballroom, full of music and laughter, fell silent as General Lewis entered. Heads turned. The MC fumbled over his words, trying to keep the show moving, but the general's presence was a force that couldn't be ignored. General Lewis raised his hand, commanding attention without effort. "Ladies and gentlemen, Before you raise another glass, I have a correction to make. Claire squeezed Frank's hand, sensing the tidal change. Her heart thudded with nerves and pride. The general continued, his voice growing softer, but no less powerful. You all came here tonight to honor heroes. Well, there's a man in this room you've already failed to honor. A man who risked everything, without applause, without cameras, without fanfare. He gestured toward Frank, who stood at the edge of the stage, awkward but resolute. That man isn't just a guest. He's the reason I'm alive. When the bullets were flying, when hope was almost gone, Frank Doyle carried us one by one out of hell. I wouldn't be here if not for him. The room was hushed, the meaning settling over every face. Frank's photo, just minutes ago ridiculed online, now became the face of valor. Claire blinked back tears, her father's hand still wrapped in hers. The mayor set his drink down, speechless. A young journalist lowered her camera, eyes wide. In the silence, General Lewis looked at Frank and nodded, a wordless salute from one soldier to another. For the first time all night, Frank allowed himself a smile, a true one, quiet and deeply felt. The general turned back to the crowd. So I say again, if he's not honored tonight, there is no honor at all. A ripple of applause started in the back, hesitant, then swelling, as the room found its conscience. People rose to their feet, clapping not for spectacle but out of genuine respect. Frank, suddenly the center of it all, glanced at Claire, gratitude and humility in his eyes. She squeezed his hand, her heart aching with pride. The moment belonged to him at last, not because he'd asked for it, but because those who knew his worth refused to let the world forget. And as the applause thundered, Frank felt, for the first time in years, seen. Frank stepped through the doors of the Montclair Hotel ballroom, arm in arm with Claire, General Lewis wheeling just ahead. The hush that had fallen outside swept through the vast chandelier-lit hall like a wave. The music stuttered and died. Waiters froze mid-step, and hundreds of eyes swung toward the commotion at the entrance. In that instant, the pageantry of the evening, every meticulously planned detail, every carefully crafted speech, felt paper-thin. The mayor, standing by the head table, looked as though someone had slapped him. Donors in designer suits exchanged uncomfortable glances, their small talk drying up mid-sentence. Some of Claire's colleagues from the Veterans Foundation stared with dawning recognition, guilt twisting their features as they realized who the rain-soaked man truly was. General Lewis, undeterred by the stares, didn't pause. He rolled straight down the center aisle, scattering a group of junior officers who'd been posing for photos near the podium. At the far end, the MC was fumbling with his microphone, unsure if he should continue with the program or cede the floor. But General Lewis made the decision for him. He stopped at the center of the dance floor and motioned for the sound system to be cut. The band leader, confused, lifted his hands off the piano keys. The chatter faded to an uneasy silence, every ear tuned to the general's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Lewis announced, his tone commanding but not angry, simply resolute. "Before you raise another glass, before you pin another medal, I must correct an oversight so shameful it can't be ignored. You have honored the wrong people tonight. The man standing here, Frank Doyle, saved my entire unit in Cambodia. He carried us through fire. He is the reason I am here to speak to you." Yet tonight, he was turned away at the door. A collective intake of breath rolled across the room. The mayor looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. A city councilwoman pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. The donors, men and women who had donated thousands for veterans' causes, were suddenly unsure of where to look. Some gazes dropped to their shoes, Others darted to the nearest exit. Claire stood by her father's side, shoulders squared, daring anyone to challenge their presence. In that moment, the years of struggle, the doubts, the lonely nights spent fundraising, the endless fight for respect, dissolved. Her father stood at the center of the room, but it was the room itself that felt exposed. Frank's clothes were still damp, his shoes muddy from the curb. He looked out at the sea of faces, some remorseful, some ashamed, others still clinging to confusion. He didn't want this kind of spotlight, but he understood its necessity. General Lewis turned to Claire, his expression softening. "Miss Doyle, you spoke tonight about honoring our forgotten veterans. Your words were true, but your father's presence is the truth. You all came here to honor the spirit of sacrifice. You nearly missed honoring the man himself." The MC, realizing the gravity of the moment, quickly surrendered the microphone to Claire. She hesitated for a breath, then stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "This is my father," she said, gesturing to Frank, her words echoing through the silent hall. "Not a security risk, not a delivery man, not a beggar in a raincoat. He is a medic who carried wounded men through fire. He is the reason I fight for veterans' dignity. And tonight, he is the reminder that our work isn't done. If a man like my father can be turned away, outside a party supposedly in his honor, how many others do we overlook every day?" She paused, scanning the room, locking eyes with several people who had brushed past Frank outside or shared the viral photo online. Honor isn't a speech. It isn't a hashtag. It's seeing people, really seeing them, even when they aren't wearing medals or uniforms. The room was dead quiet. Even the air conditioners seemed to have stopped humming. The mayor, cheeks burning, finally stepped forward, stammering apologies. "Mr. Doyle, on behalf of the city, I'm so sorry." Frank, ever calm, lifted a hand to quiet him. "Thank you, Mayor, but I'm not here for apologies. I'm just glad someone finally looked." A stirring began in the audience. Veterans in attendance rose first. Men and women in their 40s, 50s, 60s, some leaning on canes, others with medals on their lapels. They began to clap, slow and deliberate, each beat a reckoning. The applause grew, swelling through the room. Waiters in white jackets set down their trays and joined in. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Guests stood, one by one, rising not out of politeness, but out of respect. Frank's gaze found the photographer who'd snapped his picture outside. The young man looked down, ashamed. Frank offered a small, forgiving nod. The mayor, voice thick, announced, "Tonight, we honor Frank Doyle, not just for his service in uniform, but for his patience, his dignity, and the lesson he's taught us all." General Lewis rolled up beside Frank and placed a hand on his shoulder. "There are heroes among us. Let's never forget again who they are." Claire, tears in her eyes, hugged her father tightly, not caring who saw. The shame that had gripped the room turned to a collective resolve, a promise to do better, to look again, to never let gratitude become mere ceremony. For a long moment, Frank simply stood, bathed in the light of recognition he'd never asked for. He felt pride, not for the applause, but for the way his daughter stood beside him, and the way his story had finally been heard. It was a room full of shame, transformed at last into a room full of respect. The silence after Claire's words lingered, heavy and honest, broken only by the hesitant beginnings of applause from the veterans in the audience. At first it was sparse, a few hands clapping in the rear, the sound tentative and raw. But then, as if a dam had broken, the applause spread through the ballroom. More guests rose to their feet, and within moments the entire room was standing, clapping not out of habit, but out of genuine respect. The echoes bounced off crystal chandeliers and marble floors, filling every shadow and corner. Frank Doyle stood frozen for a heartbeat, unsure of where to put his hands or how to respond to such a sudden outpouring. For so many years, he'd slipped through crowds unnoticed, his service a ghost story whispered at family tables, or honored only in the privacy of his daughter's affection. Now, his life, his sacrifice, was being acknowledged not with a quiet nod, but with the thunder of hundreds of grateful hands. Claire gripped his arm, smiling through tears, her eyes shining with pride and relief. "See, Dad? They see you now." Frank managed a half-smile, shy and slightly bewildered. He looked down, shaking his head, then glanced up at General Lewis, who nodded back with a knowing smile. The general gestured for Frank to come to the stage. As Frank took his first steps forward, the room parted before him. Veterans reached out to squeeze his hand. One woman, her hair silver, her dress modest, hugged him as he passed. "You carried more than soldiers out of that jungle, Mr. Doyle. You carried hope," she whispered. The mayor, still stammering with embarrassment, guided Frank to the center of the stage. General Lewis rolled up beside him and pulled a small, battered velvet box from his lap. With trembling hands, he opened it, revealing a medal, dull with age but still gleaming in the stage lights. "Frank Doyle," the general intoned, his voice cracking. "For decades you carried a nation's burden quietly. I've kept this medal all these years, waiting for the moment I could finally thank the man who saved my life. Tonight, it's my honor to present you with this special lifetime commendation." He pinned the medal to Frank's jacket. Frank's hands shook. For a split second, he nearly protested. He'd never wanted medals, only memories that didn't ache so much. But the weight of the medal felt different. It wasn't just for him, but for every man and woman left waiting outside, for every veteran who felt invisible. Applause erupted again, louder now, raw and unrestrained. Phones flashed as guests captured the moment, some out of pride, others out of guilt, but all knowing they were witnessing something real. The MC, finally finding his voice, approached Frank and offered him the microphone. Frank hesitated, glancing at Claire, who nodded encouragingly. Frank cleared his throat, his voice rough from years of silence. "I'm not much for speeches," he said, drawing a ripple of laughter from the audience. "Never have been. I came tonight because my daughter asked me to. I waited outside because I thought maybe I was early, or maybe I just didn't look right for a place like this." He paused, scanning the crowd. "I'm not here for applause. I never was. I just wanted someone to look, someone to remember that there are men and women who gave everything and asked for nothing. Most of us don't want thanks. We just want to know we mattered, that our lives counted for something." Frank's words rang out, carried on the silence that followed. Claire felt a lump in her throat, her love and admiration for her father swelling so strong she could barely stand. Frank continued, his voice gentler now. "My daughter, she remembers. That's more than enough for me. But tonight, you all reminded me. Sometimes, the world just needs to look again." He handed the microphone back and stepped aside, overwhelmed by the applause that surged once more. This time it was joined by shouts of "Thank you" and "Welcome home" from veterans and civilians alike. The mayor, choking back emotion, tried to say something but found himself lost for words. In the crowd, faces shone with tears, old soldiers remembering friends lost, young people suddenly understanding the depth of sacrifice. Even the staff who'd brushed past Frank earlier joined in, clapping harder, some bowing their heads in shame, others smiling with relief. Claire wrapped her arms around her father in a fierce hug. "You did it, Dad. You made them see." Frank, always humble, managed to chuckle. "I think you did, Claire Bear." On stage, General Lewis raised a hand for quiet. "Let this be the lesson tonight," he said. "We must look for our heroes, not in uniforms, not just on special occasions, but in the faces we pass every day. We must not let gratitude become ceremony. We must not let dignity become costume." The audience nodded, many wiping their eyes. For once, the applause wasn't for a show. It was for redemption, for a wrong made right. A news crew in the back recorded every moment, their footage destined to travel beyond the ballroom, beyond the city. But for Frank, the world had shrunk to a simple moment. The arms of his daughter, the respect of his peers, the relief of finally, truly being seen. As the room slowly settled, the band began to play again. This time an old tune Frank remembered from his youth. A melody of homecoming, of reunion, of hope. Veterans danced with their families. Claire pulled Frank gently onto the dance floor, and for once he didn't refuse. They moved together, awkward and laughing, the world's burdens lighter for just a moment. Around them, people shook hands, made new promises, and exchanged stories. The mayor leaned over to Claire and said, "You've changed this city tonight." Claire smiled. "It's not me, sir. It's him. And it's every veteran who's ever been left out in the rain." Frank, looking around at the warm faces, finally let himself believe it. The night was no longer about speeches or medals. It was about seeing, truly seeing, the people who made the world possible. It was about redemption, earned not in grand gestures, but in simple recognition and long overdue respect. And as the final chorus played, Frank closed his eyes, grateful for this moment, and for the lesson that, sometimes, all it takes to change a heart is to look again. Frank barely slept that night. Long after the last guest had drifted home and the ballroom lights had dimmed, he sat at his kitchen table with a mug of cooling coffee. Claire stayed with him, her head resting on her folded arms. They had barely spoken since leaving the hotel, but the silence was warm, a shared quiet that said everything. But the world outside did not sleep. By dawn, Frank's story had exploded across the internet. The photo of him standing in the rain, once labeled suspicious, now topped trending lists with a new caption, "Hero shunned at Gala becomes its heart." The first viral post came from a teenager who'd attended with her father, a Marine veteran. Her video, shaky, heartfelt, showed the moment General Lewis stopped the party, Claire running to Frank, the mayor's stunned face as the room erupted in applause. "This is what honor really looks like," she wrote. The post was shared thousands of times within the hour. Soon, clips of Frank's quiet speech at the podium circulated everywhere. News anchors replayed it, their voices soft with awe. One late-night host, moved by the sincerity, said, "Sometimes the bravest people walk among us, unseen, until we finally look." What surprised Frank most were the comments from other veterans. Under every video, in every thread, men and women of all ages chimed in. "I've been him. That was me outside the VA clinic. Reminds me of my grandpa. He never talked about what he did, but he deserved so much more." Messages poured in from across the country, from small towns and sprawling cities, from people who understood exactly what it meant to be left outside one's own story. Frank scrolled through them slowly, his rough hands trembling as he read. Each message felt like a hand on his shoulder, a promise that he was not alone. Veterans thanked him for standing tall. Civilians apologized for never noticing before. Even some of the hotel staff who'd ignored him sent private notes. "We're sorry, Mr. Doyle. You changed how we see people." Claire woke to find Frank reading on his phone, tears shining in his tired eyes. She put a gentle hand on his arm. "You all right?" Frank nodded. "It's a lot. I didn't expect all this." She smiled, pride and love in every line of her face. "You deserve it, Dad. You always did." Within hours, news stations called for interviews. Reporters camped outside Frank's building, hoping for a quote or a wave. Claire handled the requests, shielding her father when it became overwhelming. She gave one interview on the steps of City Hall, her voice steady but her hands tight in her lap. "It was the most proud and ashamed I've ever felt. At the same time," she admitted. "Proud of my father, ashamed for how we let it happen. But now maybe it's a start. Maybe it makes people pay attention." Social media erupted in hashtags. #LookAgain, #HonorThem, #FrankDoyle. Teachers printed out the photo for classroom discussions. Church groups brought up the story in sermons. Even politicians, always ready to find the wind's direction, promised new programs and more funding for veterans. But for Frank, the greatest reward was in the quiet messages. One in particular stood out, a letter from a boy in Kansas. "Dear Mr. Doyle, my grandpa was a medic too. Sometimes people forget him, but now I know not to. Thank you for being brave even when it was hard. I want to be like you." Frank read it 3 times, then showed it to Claire, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's worth more than a medal right there." At the local diner, the waitress who'd always poured Frank's coffee without meeting his eyes now greeted him by name. Neighbors waved from their stoops. The grocer offered him a free bag of apples. At first, the attention embarrassed him. He'd spent so many years making himself invisible, not wanting a fuss. But as the days passed, he realized it wasn't about fame or charity. It was about finally being recognized, about not having to carry the weight alone anymore. Other veterans reached out, some he knew from old units, some total strangers. They organized a small get-together at the city park. Men and women, some with wheelchairs, some with fading tattoos and old jackets, shared stories over picnic tables and soda cans. For the first time in a long time, Frank felt part of something bigger, a brotherhood and sisterhood that had always existed, now out in the open. At one of these gatherings, a woman named Lila approached Frank with her teenage daughter in tow. "I saw the video," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "My husband. He always thought no one cared about what he'd done. He died last year. But your story, well, it helped my girl see him differently. It helped me too. Thank you." Frank was at a loss for words. He just nodded, pressing her hand between his own. Even the city government took notice. The mayor, now much more humble, invited Frank and Claire to speak at a council meeting. Frank declined the speech, but Claire spoke for both of them, reminding the officials that dignity wasn't a costume, and gratitude wasn't a once-a-year performance. She held up the viral photo. "This is a lesson," she said. "Not just about veterans, but about every person we overlook. We can do better. We must do better." As the story continued to ripple outward, the hotel where the gala had taken place announced a new annual event. The Frank Doyle Dinner, free for all veterans and their families. A mural was commissioned for the side of the building, depicting Frank not as a hero in uniform, but as an ordinary man, standing patiently, waiting to be seen. At home, Frank kept his routine. He still rose early, still drank his coffee by the window, still listened to the city's morning noises. But now, when he walked down the street, people nodded and smiled, not just at the hero from the video, but at Frank Doyle, the man. And everywhere he went, he carried with him the knowledge that his story had helped others step out of the shadows, that he was seen, and through him, so were many others. That night, as he sat by his window watching the lights of the city, Claire beside him, Frank found a peace he hadn't known in years. He looked at his daughter and said, "I guess the world finally looked, kiddo." Claire smiled and squeezed his hand. "They sure did, Dad. They sure did." And in that quiet, ordinary moment, surrounded by love and the soft hum of a city that was learning to see, Frank Doyle knew that his life, every sacrifice, every silent waiting, had made a difference. News cycles moved on as they always did, but Frank Doyle's story had already settled into the city's collective memory, echoing far beyond a single viral moment. A week after the gala, Claire found herself alone on a park bench, staring at the morning rush as commuters hurried by, their faces locked on their phones or lost in thought. The world spun forward, always eager for the next distraction, but something fundamental had changed, not just for Frank, but for everyone who had witnessed his moment of truth. A soft breeze tugged at the leaves, sunlight dappling the bench where Frank now sat, a book unopened in his lap. He watched children chase pigeons, joggers streaming past, and for once he didn't feel invisible. He was simply present, a part of the world, not apart from it. Across the playground, a small boy in a t-shirt and cargo shorts paused, watching Frank with a soldier's intensity. The boy's mother called him back, but the child hesitated, then jogged up and, with solemn formality, snapped off a salute. Frank smiled, surprised and touched. He saluted the boy in return, and the boy beamed before dashing off. Claire, watching from a distance, blinked back tears. In that simple gesture, she saw the impact of her father's life, the power of being seen, even for a moment. Later that day, Claire was invited to appear on a local radio show. The host asked her the question everyone seemed to want answered. "What's the lesson here? Why did this story touch so many people?" Claire paused, then spoke with a clarity honed by pain and love. "I think we all want to believe that we honor those who serve. We dress up, give speeches, pin medals, but too often we honor the idea, not the person. We love the costume, the symbol, the myth, until it's inconvenient, until it looks like an old man in a rain-soaked jacket at the door. We forget that dignity isn't something you put on for special occasions. It's something every human being carries, or ought to carry, every single day." Her words struck a chord. Callers flooded the radio station. Veterans, social workers, young people who had never served but had seen loved ones overlooked by the world. The line between hero and ordinary man blurred. The lesson grew bigger than Frank, bigger than the gala, bigger even than the city itself. A high school teacher wrote an essay for the local paper. "We teach our kids to stand for the anthem, to recite names from monuments, but do we teach them to see the man who sits quietly at the bus stop, medals tucked away under his coat? Do we remember them when they walk slowly, when their voices are softer, when their stories sound like memories we'd rather not hear?" Dignity is not a costume. It's the truth of who we are, when we strip everything else away. In living rooms and lunchrooms, the story was told and retold. Children asked their parents about their own grandparents. Churches organized visits to nursing homes. Scout troops sent hand-drawn cards to veterans' hospitals. Even in city council chambers, officials debated how to improve services, not just for veterans, but for anyone who had been overlooked, anyone left out in the rain. But beneath the public conversations was a quieter reckoning. Frank received a letter from a former city official, anonymous but heartfelt. "I saw you at the gala. I was one of those who turned away. I didn't recognize you, not just you, the truth. I'm sorry. I'll do better." The lesson rippled out. In one neighborhood, residents started a Look Again project. challenging each other to greet strangers, to listen, to honor the quiet lives around them. In a college philosophy class, a student wrote her thesis on the dignity of unnoticed people, using Frank's story as her central argument. Real honor, she wrote, lives in the willingness to see beyond the surface, to recognize sacrifice not as an accessory, but as the heartbeat of a community. Frank himself didn't seek the spotlight. He still spent his afternoons in the park, or reading at the library, or fixing a neighbor's leaky faucet. But now, when people saw him, they nodded. Sometimes they stopped to talk. Sometimes they just smiled, a silent acknowledgement of the distance between hero and man closing little by little. One rainy afternoon, as Frank waited for a bus, a businessman in a crisp suit hurried by, nearly bumping into him. The man stopped, turned back, and offered Frank his umbrella. "You're Mr. Doyle, right? Thank you for everything." Frank took the umbrella with a nod, watching as the man jogged off into the storm. It was a small act, but it meant everything. On television, a national commentator summed it up. "We put on our best clothes to remember those we forgot. But if we only see the uniform, not the man, we miss the point. True honor asks us to look again and again at the lives around us." In private, Claire and Frank talked about what came next. "Dad, do you think anything will really change?" Claire asked one evening, her head resting on his shoulder. Frank considered the question. "Maybe not everywhere and not all at once," he admitted, "but every story that gets told, every hand that's shaken, every person that's seen, that's a start. Sometimes that's enough to tip the balance." The city was different now. Not perfect, but aware, a little more careful. People who had once averted their eyes now stopped to listen, to say thank you, to remember that every life carries stories worth knowing. And as Frank sat on that park bench, a gentle sun breaking through the clouds, he looked around at the faces passing by. Some hurried, some paused, some simply nodded. But each one, in their own way, recognized something familiar. A quiet dignity, a worth that needed no costume, no ceremony. And in that shared understanding, Frank knew the lesson had landed. It wasn't about a medal, or even a moment. It was about the slow, persistent work of seeing and being seen, every ordinary day. That was honor, the kind that lasts. If you asked anyone in the city about Frank Doyle a year ago, few could have told you his story. He was just a figure passing through the background, a quiet man in a worn jacket, walking to the park or waiting for a bus. The kind of person people barely noticed in the blur of their busy days. But now his story lived in the hearts of thousands. His image, the old soldier in the rain, had become a reminder, a quiet challenge to look again. As spring returned and new leaves unfurled along the city's avenues, Claire Doyle stood before a packed auditorium at a local college. She'd been invited to speak, but her words tonight weren't for politicians or donors. They were for students, teachers, everyday people, all ages and backgrounds. Some had come because they'd seen the viral video. Others were simply curious. She looked out across the crowd, searching for a familiar face, and there he was. Her father, sitting quietly in the third row, his hands folded in his lap, eyes shining with a pride he would never voice aloud. Claire took a breath and began. "If the bravest man you've ever met walked past you today, would you even look?" The question hung in the air, simple and searing. My father never asked for applause. He never wore his medals in public. He just showed up every day. He taught me that honor isn't about ceremony or titles or hashtags. Real honor doesn't wear a name tag. It lives in how we see each other, in the moments we choose to really look. She told the story again, not of the gala, not of the viral moment, but of an ordinary life. The sacrifices hidden in silence, the kindness offered with no expectation of reward, the strength to keep going even when no one is watching. She spoke about the morning Frank walked her to her first day of school, the way he fixed her bike late at night, the pride he took in her stubbornness and heart. She told them about the night he was left outside, the shame and anger that filled her, and the gratitude that grew from it. But the lesson, Claire said, her voice steady and clear, was never about one man or one night. It was about all of us. How easily we forget to see each other. How quickly we let uniforms, or lack of them, tell us who matters. How much dignity and love and courage we miss, just because it doesn't look the way we expect. She paused, letting the truth settle in. The audience was silent, some with tears in their eyes, some looking down, all reflecting on the countless faces they'd passed by without a second thought. Claire closed her speech with a promise, not just to her father, but to everyone listening. Tonight, I ask you to do one simple thing. Tomorrow, next week, whenever you remember, look again. Don't let your eyes slip past the people who made your freedom possible, who make your world possible. Don't let respect be just a word. Let it be a habit. Let it be your way of life. A standing ovation filled the room, but Claire didn't look for applause. Her gaze found Frank, and he nodded, the quiet pride of a man who had finally been seen. She smiled back, heart full. Later that week, the city released a short video, a montage of moments from the gala, from the park, from everyday life. Frank's voice, recorded in a quiet room, became the narration. We dress up to remember the ones we forgot. But do we remember them when they wear old jackets, walk slowly, or sit quietly? Do we see their courage when it isn't shining in the spotlight? Real honor doesn't wear a name tag. It's there every day, in the people you pass by. It's there if you're willing to look again. Text appeared on screen. He didn't come for applause, but he left having reminded a city what honor really looks like. The video swept through social media, sparking new conversations. High schoolers shared it in their classes. Businesses started Look Again days, encouraging staff to acknowledge veterans, elders, and anyone who might otherwise be overlooked. At City Hall, the mayor unveiled a plaque by the Montclair Hotel entrance, not listing names or medals, but bearing a single inscription. Real honor doesn't wear a name tag. Remember to look again. For Frank, the noise of fame faded with the weeks. He slipped back into his routines. Morning walks, tinkering with old radios, Saturday breakfast at the corner diner. But everywhere he went, he saw the change. Not in grand gestures, but in the way people paused, nodded, smiled, or sometimes just met his eyes. One day, sitting on his favorite bench, Frank watched a young man rush by, late for work, coffee in hand. For a moment, the man slowed, glanced Frank's way, and offered a nod. A small thing, easy to miss, but full of meaning. Frank nodded back, warmed by the recognition. In that fleeting exchange, everything the city had learned was summed up. Dignity wasn't about headlines or ceremonies, but about noticing, about kindness, about seeing the whole person, not just the surface. That evening, as the sun set over the city, Frank and Claire walked together along the river, silent and content. The world was still imperfect. There would always be people left outside, stories left untold. But Frank believed, in his quiet way, that every person who remembered to look again was helping to build something better. A city, a country, maybe even a world, where no one's dignity was ever just a costume. At the edge of the water, Claire turned to her father, her voice soft. Do you regret any of it, Dad? All those years of waiting to be seen? Frank shook his head. No, not if it helped one person look again. They stood together, the city lights reflecting in the river, the world bustling behind them, moving ever forward. And in that simple, shared moment, father and daughter, teacher and student, hero and citizen, the true meaning of honor lived on. So if the bravest man you ever meet walks past you today, will you look again? Will you see the quiet strength in his step, the story in his eyes? Will you remember that real honor doesn't wear a name tag? Frank Doyle never asked for applause, but his story asked something far greater from all of us: to notice, to care, to remember, to look again.